Hey, this is Mike, G220 Radio. Welcome to tonight's show. We're going to be covering the topic of God, a simple God in a complex world. We're going to be focusing on the simplicity of God. What does that mean? And why do we need to know it? How can it help us in our walk? So stay tuned to learn more about God's simplicity.
And welcome to another episode of G220 Radio. This is episode number 423. I can't even believe how many episodes we've done of G220 Radio, and just 423 episodes. And we're going to be talking about the simplicity of God. A simple God. Is God simple? Well, we're going to talk about it here tonight. And as always, I have with me Mike Miller. Mike, how we doing, brother?
Doing pretty good. I've been missing work, so here's everyone for my work. Yep, that's what I hear all day. Now you can experience the joys of my work.
Yeah. And we have back with us again. He is back to G220 Radio, and we've got the original, not the duplicated or the non-authentic. We have the original Natty P.
I'm rarely imitated, and so therefore never duplicated. But I am Nettie P. I am here on G220, enjoying the lockdown in Ohio. Shopping's great on lockdown because the stores are empty, and so I have the whole place to myself.
Yeah. Okay, Mike, you said you're at home right now, but how, other than work-wise, how has this maybe affected you guys being locked down? Or I don't even know if you are locked down in Kentucky.
We're not, as far as I know, we're not locked down unless the governor said something in the last, 3 days that I don't know about. Mm-hmm. Shows you how up to date I am on this whole thing. For the most part, for us, it hasn't changed much, maybe outside of not having church obligations throughout the week, outside of Sunday mornings, being the sole tech guy at my church. That kind of falls on me since we're live streaming it. So yeah, well, I guess a lot more free time in a sense. I do work from home now, so that's been getting used to working, and my office is upstairs so that we don't interrupt each other. My wife also works from home. So yeah, it hasn't really, outside of kind of freeing up some time, it really hasn't, we haven't had much change all too much.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Nathaniel?
How's my life changed? It's more inconvenient. I have to run outside, so I don't get to go to the gym. I don't get to go to Chipotle because only the drive-thru is open, so I'm not going to order Chipotle at the drive-thru. That's just one of those things you need to see to make it. But my job is essential, so my life's pretty much the same.
Yeah, there really hasn't there hasn't been too much of a change for us in our household. Because we homeschool our kids. The only one of our kids goes to a Christian school, and this was actually going to be his last year there, and then we was bringing him into the homeschooling regime. But he, other than that, really not much has changed. We've gone out to the stores and stuff like that. Like you said, Nathaniel, there's still people out there, but there's a lot of less stuff on the shelves, but there is still a lot of space in these stores to go to. Now, Mike, you had mentioned the church and doing stuff online. Let me ask you guys here, and I know it's not something we talked about before the show, but what are your guys' thoughts? I've seen people go back and forth at each other, or I shouldn't say going at each other, but people making statements for those who don't have the faith to come meet together, they would say, and basically is what they're trying to get at. You don't have the faith to come together. You're kind of letting the government, shut you down, and a lot of conspiracy theories. And then on the other hand, saying, those who are meeting together or deciding to meet together, they're saying, well, you're not caring for your neighbor. You're not caring for those that may come together, that you may possibly get infected with this virus. And I think, me personally, and then you guys can jump in. So I'm not necessarily putting you on the spot, give you a little more time, although I know you guys are probably prepared anyway. But I think that we as Christians have to be gracious with our pastors and elders and leaders of our churches to make the right decisions for their congregation based upon the information they're receiving. I don't think this is necessarily the end of our freedoms, though that could be something that comes down the road in the future, should God decide to put that in place, by his decree. But I think we just have to be gracious with our elders, pastors, love them, pray for them, that they're making the best decisions for their churches. What do you guys, anything you guys would say to that?
I would say, so my church has decided not to meet, to adhere to the recommendations given by the governor of Kentucky and the president. And for those who would say, well, we don't have enough faith, I mean, okay, you can say that, but at the same time, there's a sense in which you're testing God. Like, we're to be wise in how we deal. And giving that this is a bigger threat, we've seen it take hold of countries that wisdom has it. Now, if you choose to continue, I mean, that's your choice, and obviously God will judge you or not judge you accordingly. But I do think in this time there is, to say, well, you don't have enough faith, it almost seems like they're testing God is, with it. And so I don't know. I do think it is very careful in pastors. I know my pastor has had to take a lot of care and to think about what we're going to do, what is with it. And I've been very proud of him because he's very much a germaphobe. And so he, has, with wisdom and cautiousness, try to lead this church, our church, the way in which he thinks is faithful in this time and in our situation.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not an elder. I'm not my elder, that's for sure. So one of the things that we're supposed to do is our elders are appointed for our care, and so if we have enough faith, we will trust the decisions that they make. Now, what would I do if I was in that situation? It's kind of a hard question because I'm not in that situation. I am in my 30s and I'm healthy, and it's easy for me to sit at home by myself, not having children or other people who I'm responsible for, to say I would do one thing or another. But the elders are in charge of the church, and unless they are doing something openly against the word of God, then you should have faith that that's who God's appointed to take care of your soul.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And how do you think, do you guys, I mean, we're going to be talking about the simplicity of God here in a complex world and dealing with this COVID-19 that we are experiencing as a nation and is, consuming the entire world. There's this fear of it popping up in all these countries. And so this massive virus that's going across the world. Now, we can talk about, there is nothing that happens apart from God's decree. God has a plan in it. But what are some things that you think maybe that will be different after we have experienced this? Maybe the church will do or see differently, or that God may do within his church, as if we are able to get back to gathering together either within the next few weeks or the next couple months. What do you guys think? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I think maybe for a little bit, appreciation of going to church and being part of a community. I mean, it was just something I've recognized this past Sunday. I mean, I got to church at shortly before 10, set up, have everything. Our music leader came, our pastor and their families came, and for me, it's kind of somewhat normal. Like I'm always doing stuff for the service, and then the service hits, and I'm going and doing things. Even though this is a little bit different, watching a YouTube stream and that. But I do think there is, in just this kind of virtual watching of a pastor present a biblical message, that it should, I think, draw us together because of verses like Hebrews 10. We're not to forsake the assembling of the saints. We're to encourage each other and to love and good works. Our faith is strengthened together as a body, and we can't do that. And so really a prayer is that church becomes more important, that we see the value of being able to meet together on a Sunday. And just to think about it, Christians in China are able to meet together in secret in underground churches, but they get to meet together and we can't. And so there's that kind of referral and maybe to pull that to bring about it, to show like the church is important. You can't do church on the internet. That is why my pastor has said, when we're able to meet together, this live streaming thing's done, and I'll be thankful for it, because it's being there, feeling the presence of the Spirit in the worship. That when we come together, it's a spiritual thing we do together, and you just can't do that at home watching YouTube or Facebook or whatever you choose to take in the service.
And before you jump in, Nathaniel, Mike, as you were saying that, I think we can all testify to the reality of this. I think me and you have talked about this before, Mike. There is something different. As you said, listening to a sermon online. You could listen to a sermon from a pastor online there's a completely different move of the Spirit when you're under the preaching of that pastor in the body gathered together. I've listened to people online and I've heard their sermons. I've gained from it. I've grown from it, but then sat under them while they were preaching and was like, wow. Like I mean, because the Spirit is moving through the preaching of his word. Go ahead, Nathaniel.
I don't know. What do I think? What's the question again? What am I supposed to answer? What's going to be different?
Yeah. What do you think that may be different when we are able to get back? That maybe the mindsets of Christians or churches in general. Maybe they'll change the way they do some things. What do you think, man? This is where we find out whether or not you're a true prophet of God, because whatever doesn't come to pass.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what'll be different. Something should be different. I don't know. I mean, I shared a link to a filmmaker that I'm connected to on the Facebook. Made a comment about God canceling worship in our country, essentially. And I mean, he didn't like call down and phone down and cancel worship, but from a decretive sense, he canceled worship. And so my biggest fear is that nothing will be different. There's something in our lives, at least in in our own hearts, or even more so in our churches. I'm afraid that nothing will be different. That's my fear, because something should change because of this in our hearts.
Yeah. You know, I think that what this should do, and I know my wife and I were kind of talking about this the other day, is even though not much has really changed for us, and you know, we're very passionate about the local church, being connected to the local church, a part of the local church, serving in a local church. We're very passionate about doing evangelism, going out and doing that, sharing the gospel with people on the streets, going to the abortion center and proclaiming the gospel there. We're very passionate about the ministry of G220 Radio, where we get together here as brothers and we come and we talk about topics from all over the place, you know, from Genesis to Revelation and everything in between that we can kind of speak about related to God's word. And yet, even in that, there still is within, you know, as me and my wife were talking, there's this comfortableness that we have here as a nation. Like we were just talking about the parks not opening up. Like, we love to go to Cedar Point, right? What would that look like if it was different? Yeah. And me and my wife was driving in the car the other day, and we was going to pick up a used mattress but a bed set that my wife had found on the marketplace thing that somebody was selling their house and getting rid of, and was using it for what do you call that when you stage your house? Staging, I guess is what they call it. You know, so they had it in there, and so we picked it up, and we was driving out there, and I said, you know, it's interesting because I've been to third world countries. When I was in the military, I've been places, and I've been places where it was very poor, and yet people were content. But here in America, we have so much. I'm looking forward to the Cedar Point season to take my children so they can have a good time. And I'm like, but what if that changes? What if that's gone? You know, what if some of the things that we just have these luxuries or this comfort in life is just completely gone? Then what? You know what I mean? How then do we respond? Are we still content? Are we still, you know, going forward and seeing that in Christ, He is our all in all, you know? And so those are the things that was kind of sticking out to me in the conversation I was having with my wife, is like, I would really hope that through this, many Christians and many churches see that what is most important is not all of these things that we have, the comfort of our, even though we may have homeless people in this country, people that are below poverty level, nothing to the degree, I would say, of many of these third world countries, right? You know, famines and you know, they don't have the amount of funds that we have. I mean, even those that are to our poorest degree can receive, you know, benefits from the government. Now, of course, you do have homeless. You have those, you know, those circumstances that are pretty bad, and you want to pray for those people. But I mean, for the most part, we're a rich nation, and so there's comfort in that. But if our economy collapses, what then? You know what I mean? What then? What do we do as Christians? How then do we respond? And I think that with this topic that we're going to be speaking about, the simplicity of God, we can find comfort in God for who He is during the times of a crisis or an epidemic, or pandemic, as they're saying. As Mike has titled our show, The Simplicity of God in a Complex World. And so I think it is really good topic for us tonight. Seeing what's going on here. All right. Sorry about that. Natty P was throwing me off there, sending chats over to the thing, and I was like, is that popping up on the screen? So, but I think that this is a good topic for us to get into tonight. And so let's kind of do that.
So topic is divine simplicity. And I guess just to define it, what are we talking about divine simplicity? To say what we're not talking about, we're not saying that God is simple to understand. It's not about our understanding of him. What we're talking about when we describe divine simplicity is that all that is in God, is kind of what you could say is the positive assertion. That God cannot be, in a negative assertion, be divided, can't be split up. And so how we can think of this is when we decide to say, well, God's love is more important than God's justice, we've split God up.
Mm.
So what divine simplicity says is, well, no, God is both love and justice, and they are the same, and they come out from him in his being. And this gets into other aspects, like even with when we consider that God is love, as First John tells us, it's not that God is love and how we love. How we love is reactionary. Mm-hmm. Something, we feel something or something is done to us, and we then have something that comes out of love. When we say God is love, what we say is that, in a sense, in his nature, he is love. And so when he does something, it is love. And it's coming from him. But at the same time, when God does something, he's also justice and impassible or without passions, without emotions. That he is all powerful, and all of who God is, and when he does it, it is all of him with it. And so simplicity is not something that is simple to think about. It is quite hard and complex. What makes it different when we can think of God as simple, when we consider maybe a children's catechism who says, who is God? Say God is a spirit and does not have a body like man. We can see that there's a difference between God, who is spirit, and man, who is made up of both spirit and a physical body. Intertwined together and mixed, but still divided. And when we consider death, when the spirit leaves the physical indwelling, there's a sense in which the person has been divided, but God is not that way. So divine simplicity is that you obviously, it's something derived from a study of the Bible. It does have roots in philosophical thinking.
Well, let's talk about that right there, Mike.
Yeah.
Since you are our resident theologian, this was your title. So, no, Mike. Mike, I think I could speak for Nathaniel when I say this. I think he would agree with me. When we have theological areas where we want to learn something or we don't have an understanding of something, we'll go to Mike, because Mike is our resident theologian. So when you talk about this philosophical thing, this is one of the arguments that many people will say, well, your whole understanding of things, it's philosophical. It's not derived from Scripture. Because even when you read through Dossel's book on all that is in God, or the other book, None
Greater.
None
by
Greater.
Matthew Barrett.
Yeah, None Greater by Matthew Barrett. They'll say this is not necessarily derived from a proof text. Like, we don't have this proof text for this, but we deduce it from looking at the character of God. And so, what would you say to help us understand, and even the listeners understand, when we say it's a philosophical, or there is a philosophical argument here, that we can do that without worrying about conflicting with the Bible? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because that's what people's
like,
arguments are going to be, especially non-Calvinistic arguments.
Yeah. So part of the understanding is that philosophy is not bad in and of itself. Philosophy is a search for wisdom. It's a search to understand the world and how to think. So when you start getting into what is truth, that's what is called an epistemological question. Epistemology is a division of philosophy in kind of the classicals and the studies of it. Logic falls in that. And so, in a sense, we have to use philosophy to even read our Bibles. We come to the Bible with presuppositions and other we come with presuppositions to the Bible, and that's how we read it. And you might say, well, we shouldn't read the Bible that way with presuppositions. And I'd argue, well, it depends on your presuppositions. Like, if I come to the Bible because the Bible's told me that is inerrant, so I come to the Bible on its own turn as it's inerrant, so I'm coming with a presupposition. Now, my presupposition is coming from the Bible, and that's what we have to do. So if we're going to do philosophy correctly, we need to do philosophy from a theological grounding. Even Hume, who's an English philosopher, atheist, he's doing philosophy with a theological grounding. It's just called atheism, not Christianity. And so even in a sense, and kind of how it's been known as, theology has always been the queen of the sciences. That you can't really do science without having a theological perspective. Obviously, atheists will say, well, no, but their theological perspective would just be an atheistic perspective with it. So we use philosophy all the time, and we can't discredit that when we're talking about theology. Because then how do we know that we have gone too far, or that how we think of God is actually reasonable and how we do it? So philosophy then comes a great help. And the church has recognized that even Greek philosophers, while they were wrong, did provide ways and categories that the Bible also presents in these ways, and to think better with it. So Platonism, or Platonic thought, while leads to like the Gnostic heresy is part of that, and some of his ideas of the physical world not being real, but the spiritual world is. Some of those ideas are wrong, and there are some other ideas that have helped Christians to better think more about who God is, especially as one who is life, and who, the fullness of life, you could say, dwells.
Yeah, I mean, philosophy is thinking, and it's how we study thinking, and we're supposed to take every thought captive to Christ, even the thoughts about thoughts. So I would say there is a Christian way and a non-Christian way to do just about everything. And so when people pit science against the Bible, or philosophy against the Bible, or pick a mathematics against the Bible, I think that's just absolutely downright foolish, because God is truth, and all truth is God's truth, and God's not made up of parts. So if something's true, it doesn't matter where it comes from, it's true, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is, in my reading of those two books. Actually, I listened to the audio book of that None Greater the other day, and I have the book right here, All That Is in God, but I also picked it up on audio and listened to that today. And in both of them, the same thought was stated, that this is not a new concept, the simplicity of God. This is something that the church fathers, they held on to it. And even during the time of the Reformation, coming back to things, even the second group of them, after the Reformers, they were holding on to this simplicity of God. But yet now today, we see it as so many people it's not even really something that's taught or thought about. You start bringing up those kind of thoughts from, quotes from a book like this or something on the simplicity of God, divine simplicity, and you're going to get met with resistance by some Christians. And not only those, because you're talking about God's being without parts. This all goes together. We talked about this before the show. We're not talking about God without passions tonight, but the passions, emotions, all these things all go together. And so when you start putting up, quotes or thoughts about this, you're going to get hit with resistance, not just from those who hold to a theistic, like mutualism, or an open theistic kind of view, but also even from people who would hold to more along the lines of our thinking with Calvinism. That thought is still, kind of out there, because, again, this is not something that we see a lot of people taking up the time to study or to get familiar with. It's new to them, even though it's not new.
Yeah, and I can even say, at least from what I can remember, in my systematic theology classes, it wasn't something I was taught, both at where I got my undergrad and, where I have my master's from. And so this is, even for me, a more recent discovery and to think through, and just to consider, what does this mean? Like, is this important? And the more to think, thinking through the issue, it is. I was listening, Reform Forum just released a podcast, an updated kind of podcast from James Dolenzal in his book, All That Is in God, as Ricky has shown. And just the importance of applying simplicity when we talk about the Trinity. When we consider God is 3 in 1, 3 persons in one nature. Well, James Dolenzal was very quick to say, tritheism is a much better explanation for kind of the Trinitarian concept, except for the fact that God is simple and can't be divided, so that the persons cannot be divided. And, we talk about the wills, like, is there 3 wills of God? Well, kind of, it depends if, wills in a person, or if the wills in the nature, but, and the debate that goes with it. But considering just God's simplicity, say, well, if he can't be divided, that means the wills can't be divided.
Right.
And and that there is then this wholeness of God. So then God can say to Moses, I am who I am. I'm
Right.
Yahweh.
Right.
And that when Yahweh does something, it's all of Yahweh. And it's not just part of him.
Yeah.
And just we think about this COVID-19 and all of that, and whatever God is doing with it, because we know God has a plan, he enacts his plan. So just even in it, when God acts, he acts both in love and in justice. He acts according to his providence, and he acts according towards his power and his knowledge. All of this is God acting in once, and it's all, as they would say, a pure acts. So it is coming from him, and it's not influenced by anything else.
Yeah.
God isn't influenced by something else, which then, when we consider that Molinism, the idea of middle knowledge, has to now deny God's simplicity.
Yeah.
Because knowledge is outside of God and is restricting his hands in what he can do. So when we start losing this idea of simplicity, as I've kind of thought more of it, especially recently because of the show, the more important it becomes, and just having a solid foundation for theology proper, and all that we can know about the God who has revealed himself in the scripture.
Yeah. And Mike, just like you, brother, this is fairly new to me as well. Like, because it wasn't maybe within the last year or so that these terms, I started to become more familiar with the impassibility of God, and you know, God without passions, and then divine simplicity, and aseity. You know, you start to get familiar with some of these things. And if you remember, we had a show where we talked with a oneness Pentecostal, somebody that I actually work with, who would describe himself more as a partialist, that Jesus is a part of God. And this, just kind of like we have parts on our body, like if you was to remove my arm, that's the analogies he was trying to use. But this completely just breaks that down, because obviously you are denying the simplicity of God in that, because if Jesus is only a part of God, he's not wholly God, fully God, right? But the scriptures tell us clearly that he is fully God. And the same thing goes with the Father. If the Father is giving off a part of himself now in Christ, like let's think those people who believe in that Christ is God, but and you can help me with the name of this, Mike, if it's a name, but he becomes like he's a created then divinity, you know, that comes after Arianism, becomes afterwards. Well, God is giving a part of himself away. So now he is no longer fully God. A part of him has been given away. You know, and so this kind of addresses that. But if you deny this, I mean, obviously, if you hold to those things, you're denying the simplicity of God in that. And I think about those things, and it also helps you when you mentioned that God says to Moses in the bush, I am that I am, right? That statement right there, we should really look at that with awe, because God is declaring, just like, I mean, he's declaring it better than we can in words, but I am that I am, just like all that is God is, all that is in God is God. I am that I am is sending you. It's just it's a powerful statement that he makes about his name, about who he is to Moses.
Yeah, and I think, kind of thinking through it, and I kind of go back to a Jehovah's Witness encounter I had on my front porch. And when we try to play this hierarchical game of God's attributes, and we always, it just seems, because of the idea, and I think because of the warm, fuzzy feelings we get to say that God is love and he loves me, and kind of what, you know, this grandpa love, as other people have said, when we try to elevate an attribute, it minimizes other things and it shows them to not be equal. And they like to do that with love, which I always find kind of now, I guess not always, but now I find kind of ironic in that Isaiah, when God shows up in the temple, the seraphim say, holy, holy, holy.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially say, God is holy, God is holy, God is holy. They say it 3 times in the presence of God. So why isn't God's holiness above God's love? You know, if we play that hierarchical game. But that's not how God is described to us. God is described to us when we study his attributes in ways that they're not in competing against each other. They're unified and they work together, and that to elevate one and downplay another really starts creating a God kind of in our own image. And to kind of separate, as theologians would say, the creator-creature distinction.
Yeah.
That God is not like us. He doesn't love the way we love. He doesn't have justice the same way that we have justice. His justice is perfect. His love is perfect. He doesn't need to find truth. He is the truth. He doesn't need to become stronger. He is as strong as he can always be. And even nowadays, there's some who would say, and I'll probably butcher this, and as I kind of think through it, that in some way the creatures kind of affect God. And if that's the case, well, then God is now mutable.
Right.
He can change. But we know God doesn't change. That's why we can take great hope that the one who saves us will keep us until the end, because he doesn't change. And so the simplicity kind of helps us to put these all together in a way that sees them as all equal and important. And while we try to think of them separately, in the end, we always need to bring them back together, because that's where they belong.
Yeah. And I think, you know, what tends to happen is, I think we've all probably are guilty of doing this. We tend to look at God or try to understand God from what we know about man, right? So when we look at God's attributes, his characteristics, and we look at like God's love or his righteousness or his mercy or grace, we try to compare that with how we would view that from ourselves and just say, but it's better than how we would do it, but we're somewhat comparing it that way. But we, as you said in the beginning, Mike, we are kind of ruled then by those emotions. Like, I love my wife unconditionally, but when my wife is doing things for me, serving me in such a way, maybe getting me food or doing certain things for me, then I may love her a little bit more, as if she was just not doing anything for me, right? So that love varies based upon what my wife is doing or not doing. You know, your children listening. I mean, you love them, but your anger is going to change because of, you know, response to them. Your grace is going to change. How you're gracious with them and whatnot. Where God is not moved by those things, as you said, he's immutable, so he's not moved by that. He's not changing based upon our actions that we are doing. And as you said, Mike, this is the beauty of this divine simplicity of God. And again, it's new for us as well. It's new for me, like I said, so trying to really dig into this. But you see, in the beauty of it is knowing that all of this works together. And it not works together. All of this is God. It's not God is some love. God is, gracious. He's merciful. He's holy. He's just. That all of it. As he says to Moses, I am that I am. In that book, all that is in God is God, and you can look at that and not divide him into those parts and say he's part this, part that, but it's God. It flows from God. Everything flows from God. In him we move and have our being. Right?
I think it could be helpful. Where the simplicity of God kind of started hitting home with me is I was reading Tozer, book of sermons entitled, I Call It Heresy. That's the title of the first sermon. I was reading that book, and he talked about God's love being infinite. And so thinking to the catechism question, what is God? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. And it goes on. But thinking about each attribute one at a time, as it were, in the interplay in between his love and his love being infinite. He's a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable. In seeing how infinite interacts with love and unchangeable interacts with love. So if his love for me, he doesn't just have a little love for me, he has infinite love for me, and he's unchangeable. And so his love is unchangeable. And it's true love because he's truth. And so even just like thinking about it a little bit at a time helped me to perhaps grasp somewhat of this lofty kind of a topic. It's very hard to comprehend comprehend God. Like some of these things are easily apprehendable. You can know that's the way it is, but it's one of those things that's very difficult to comprehend. Sorry, I'm mixing up my hensions.
Which just continues to push on the creation distinction.
Right.
That we're not the creator. Just so to have it. So it's question 7 in the Baptist Catechism. I don't know what it is in the Westminster, because I don't have it. I have a Baptist Catechism. What is God? God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, and his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. And so there's a lot there. I know Ricky shared on our Facebook, the confession on that and how that works. And just like thinking, I do think, to kind of Nathaniel's point, this is difficult. And I think part of it too is because as Christians, kind of as we started kind of discussing simplicity, is that we tend not to think about philosophy and the difference in how they try to develop what is essential, what is an accident or accidental, to what someone is, and to think ontologically what is a being, and even now, kind of even studying this and getting into some of like the aseity and impassibility and some of these other terms that are more new into my own language and understanding, is like the people who thought of these things, or to discover them, would be the best way. Probably not the best way. Kind of thought through it and worked through these things. Definitely had philosophical engagements. And so I think for us now, that makes it hard because we're not, I can name some philosophers, maybe articulate a little bit what they believe, but I have no way, a philosophical background enough to think as fully as, James Dolezal has talked about. And I think in that for some maybe, what makes this even more difficult to understand, because there is a lot of philosophical terms.
Yeah.
And so just, with all things theological, persevere.
Yeah.
And go to the end, because I think it is important.
Yeah. I want to say something here, and maybe you guys, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. But oftentimes we hear the arguments that, oh, you're just holding on to the traditions of men or people who have come before you and their philosophical ideas. We've already talked about philosophy. But honestly, this is my opinion. And again, you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong in this. It's my opinion that I believe that there are some very smart, educated men who are really thinking through this today. But I look back at these older church fathers, people in the faith, not that they always had everything right? Because there's things we would disagree with them. But I think that there was much more deep thought going into a lot of their thinking and what was coming out of their thinking. Again, not perfect. They weren't always right. I think there's things we would disagree with. But I think when you look at today, I heard this said, I'll put it like this, and maybe you guys can then go off of that. I was at a conference one time, and I heard it said that even the best theologians we have today would have just been normal around some of these theologians back then. If that kind of gives you an idea of where I was going with this. Like, these men were really thinking this through. When you go back to the councils and things that were coming forth, they were really sitting down to think this through. They were saturated in books and learning and taking the time to do that. And honestly, we have all the access to read things, and there are some theologians. I'm not saying there's people that don't study. They're well more studied than I am, right? I'm nowhere near many of these guys. I mean, I'm just trying to learn these things. And so, but when you think about it, there was not all these distractions that we have today. Now, they would have had distractions in their own time, but there was men who, they wanted to learn. They wanted to read. You look at some of these guys, they were going to these good universities, trying to think of some, Harvard, Princeton, these universities to learn, and even further than going back, right? To learn and get these educations at a really young age. And then going into, you think of Calvin, so many of these at young ages really getting these great, theological or degrees to study, to learn things, and then applying it to theology, all the things that they were learning. Whereas today, I think that we are, when you look at it, we don't necessarily, not that there aren't theologians and guys that do, but we don't necessarily take the time to really try to think through these things to the depth that they did.
Yeah, I think there's truth there. I don't know if I would say that our best thinkers would be common, like just kind of common. And maybe it's just a wrong understanding. I feel like you have more parity. Either you're kind of poor and you don't really think about these, or you're kind of in the church and you're able to think about these things. But also to consider that in the past 100 years, how much education has changed and what people know. Like, it was Southern Seminary, for example. Most people entering the seminary when it begins had a grasp of Latin. I don't know many seminary students that I knew that had a grasp of Latin. A lot of ones that I knew had Latin kind of had PhDs or were going for PhDs, in which you have to learn Latin. And so there is a difference in education And even Calvin, who I've studied the most of in kind of his background, he first studied to be a lawyer. One of his first books was on a philosopher. And so there is a sense in which that there was a more closeness between philosophy and theology, in which it gave them these categories to think that we're just not considered.
Mm-hmm.
Like my first dab into philosophy is in college. And so I do think I think that's what makes us different. Distractions and whatnot, they had their distractions in their own days, as you said. But I just do think we're not equipped to think in these categories, which makes books like Interpreting Scripture in the Great Tradition kind of helpful, and has received really good reviews, because it's now like, look, we need to think outside of our modernistic framework. Like, people has been studying the Bible for a long time, and we need to understand, what are they saying? Why are they making that distinction between homoousios and homoousios? Why is it important? This one letter,
Mm-hmm.
the oda, the I in the Greek language. Why does it matter?
Right.
And I don't always think
go ahead,
we're
Mike,
given those categories to think in, at least nowadays.
Yeah.
And I think some of it has to do with just the downplay of philosophy. That philosophy is atheistic, but we're Christians and we do theology, and there's that kind of tension.
Right. I think too, though, that even within Christianity, there are Christians, and I'm sure we've all encountered Christians like this, that they love the Lord. They will go out and just give their shirt off their back for somebody, because of their love for the Lord. But when it comes to theology, like really trying to study and understand something, it's very basic. It's very minute. It's not like they've taken a lot of time to study these things, and they'll say, I'm sure we've all heard this, well, I mean, that getting into all that theology stuff is just a little bit above my pay grade, or whatever, excuse they may use in that. And they'll say, I just love Jesus. I just love Jesus. And I think what we've seen, as you said, over the last 100 years with education kind of being dumbed down, but then also within many of the churches, not all the churches, but within many of the churches that we see in modern evangelicalism, there's more of a just love Jesus. We don't really need to worry so much about the deep theological things. I've even had it said to me not too long ago that I don't really get into the debating and stuff like that over doctrine and theology. I just, hey, we all love Jesus. We're in unity. There's unity there. Well, yes, there's unity with brothers and sisters even when we disagree, but doctrine and the right understanding of theology, or trying to understand theology, which is the study of God, should cause a greater doxology within you in your worship of Him. So would you not want to take the time to study out doctrines like the simplicity of God or the impassibility of God, or many of the great things that we can go back to history and pull these books up and read and study to learn what these thinkers were thinking through about God, and not just Jesus loves everybody type of theology like we get in many of these modern evangelical churches today.
So I enjoy the doctrine of simplicity. I enjoy all the doctrines because, as you said, it does help us to know and love God more, Ricky. And it's like when you get married, you don't stop talking to your wife the day after the wedding. I mean, you get to know her deeper and deeper and deeper. I can imagine, I've been told. But pretend I'm little Natty P sitting in the pews I'm shaking in my boots because there's a virus and everything's shut down. What is the consolation that I am to derive out of this doctrine of simplicity? How do I apply this to my heart and my life?
Well, so application has 2 points. It's either to change how you think about God or how you're to act, kind of a command.
Mm-hmm.
Although how you think about God does have an impact on how you act. I think, and even to Ricky's point, I just love Jesus. Well, how do you love, like, who is Jesus? Like, theology can't be trivialized.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you know this. But to think about that. So even when we consider divine simplicity, it should change us on how we are to think about God, and that to say, even now, I don't know what God is doing, but I know that whatever he's doing, it's all of him. And so, in some points, what he's doing may be love, and that a saint who's been suffering can now be with Jesus. As much may that pain be. But at the same time, for someone else, it may be God saying enough is enough, and I'm ending your life here because you've caused too much pain, and it is now your time to receive the judgment due to you with it. And so it should change how we think about how God is acting in the world, knowing that it's all of him that is acting with it. So there is grace in there. There is mercy in this. We don't know how it's going to reflect in our lives, and we don't know maybe the particulars of what God is doing. But we know God is merciful, and what he's doing will have mercy. It may not seem like it. And we may not fully understand, again, finite beings trying to understand an infinite being, the creator creation kind of distinction in it. But that understanding simplicity and thinking about these deep things of God, first off, lets us to worship God greater because we have a better understanding of him.
Right.
And when we think about these things, we would act differently. How that may be. So it is very important. That is not just a high ivory tower theological concept.
Right.
That theology is done in the church for the church and for the proclamation of the gospel, and that it does help us. And kind of just thinking about it, 1 Timothy 4:16, Paul is telling Timothy, keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching, both my conduct and what you're teaching.
Right.
So we need to watch these things. Like, you just can't love Jesus and not worry about theology.
Right.
You have to have both. And the one who thinks, well, that's out of my reach. Well, okay, there's other things you can try to better learn about God, about our salvation, about what he has planned in this world, what his church is to look like. There's other things to study in theology. But the point is to study, to know who God is. God delights in people who know who he is. And that we should not just stop at, well, I love Jesus. Because in the end, the bottom line is, well, who is this Jesus that you love? Was he a created being or was he not? And now you're into theology.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, that was good. I was consoled by your answer. That was really good.
Agreed. Well, that's been G220 for tonight. Hope you enjoyed episode 423 on the simplicity of God in a complex world. As I said within the show, and Mike has said, and Nathaniel has said, we're learning these things. We're trying to understand God, understand the doctrine of God. Excuse me. And so if you have any questions or comments, or maybe there was something we have said that you would like some more qualification or understanding on, please email us at g220radio@gmail.com. Again, that's g220radio@gmail.com, and we will do our best to get back with you and answer. And so until next, my throat here. Until next time, that's been G220 Radio. So God bless and good night.